Yeah, adversarial classification and differential privacy. This is joint work with Jairo Giraldo, who left us already and he couldn't come to this meeting. Myself, Murat Kantarshoglu, who's also here, and Jonathan Katz, who recently moved from UMD to GMU. So, so to talk about some of the new privacy problems, I'd like to start with this quote from Kevin Ashton, who's the British entrepreneur who coined, or who's credited for coining the IoT terminology in 1999. So he was recently interviewed by Smithsonian Magazine, and they were asking him, well, what are your perspectives into what you think this IoT technology has evolved, and what are some of these paradigm changes that are happening? And he said, well one of these big paradigms that we can see is that in the 20th century, computers were brains without senses. They only knew what we told them, right? So to know something, we in general would have to type it onto them or interact with the computer in a certain way. And nowadays, there's more information in the world that people can type on a keyboard. And in the 21st century, nowadays you can see computers basically sense things. They even have more senses than us. And they collect all the information passively without people realizing it. And that can lead to some privacy concerns. So there's been a couple of privacy concerns related to this new large-scale collection, fine-grained collection of data. Some of the, one of the nice quotes that I like to use in terms of, for example, location privacy on connected vehicles is a Ford executive who said, we know everyone who breaks the law, we know when you're doing it, we have a GPS in your car, so we know what you're doing. Of course, when they asked him for clarification, Ford later retracted the comments. They were saying that he misspoke, but we probably think, yeah, we know that he was not entirely incorrect. And there's been several cases, you probably have heard about them, like Uber, like employees being able to track people in New York City, or celebrities being able to track celebrities. Some vulnerabilities, for example, in ways that hackers can stalk you, and even, for example, electricity monitoring applications, they can reveal a lot of information about your data. Fortunately, I don't know why the slides are cutting on the top. But anyway, so in addition to privacy, we also have another problem, and is that a lot of this data that we're collecting from the physical world is also crowdsourced. So one of the problems is like the verification or the trustworthiness of this data, right? So there's been several examples nowadays on, for example, users doing data poisoning in ways because some neighborhoods didn't want traffic jams in their quiet neighborhood, and they say, well, Waze is to avoid the traffic jam in the highway. Waze was routing them through these quiet neighborhoods, and then users organized to say, well, report accidents. So they were saying, well, we are a community. If everyone reports accidents, then Waze is not going to route through us. And for example, this artist that recently showed how to, he has a video on YouTube, and he shows how while he's walking, the traffic jam follows him with these 99 phones and this little cart. And there's many other problems with the quality of the data. Like you probably have heard several cases where people just are following GPS directions and they end up at the bottom of a lake because the highway wasn't, or the maps weren't updated enough, or some potential attacks, like for example, some soldiers getting attacked because they took out the wrong Waze app. The Waze directed into a different direction. And so in general, we see that we have two problems that are arising from this collection of crowdsourced IoT data. So obviously we want classical utility. We're deploying these services because we want something out of it, right? We want better routing services. We want better energy, electricity consumption and efficiency, more green devices. And so we want to be able to use the data. So that's the first priority, right? The reason why we're deploying these new technologies. Another priority is privacy. So we want to make sure that whatever data is released is ideally protected so the consumers are not affected by it. And in addition, we want security. So security meaning we want trustworthy data. Ideally, we should be able to detect data poisoning. So if the crowdsourced data is being manipulated somehow. And in particular, this is this third property is different from classical utility, in particular in the terms of differential privacy, when we tend to look a lot about between privacy versus utility. There's a lot of studies about it. So like for your budget, like how much useful is your data, like the previous speaker was also talking about that. We want enough privacy, but at the same time, we also don't want to make data useless. So security could be thought of another utility, but it's different because it's an adversarial setting. So there's an attacker intentionally trying to mislead you or affect that utility. So the question is, how do we handle that? And that's what we're trying to do in this paper. So in this paper, we're proposing a new adversary model for this type of settings, where the idea is an attacker that discovers that the same crowdsourcing attack or the same attacks that we saw before in my previous slide, data poisoning attacks, but the attacker knows that the data is using differential privacy. So the question is, how can he or she launch attacks that are hidden in this differential privacy? So our attacker is different from traditional differential privacy mechanisms. The attacker is not curious. It's not trying to infer information about users. Our attacker is just saying, well, we have differential privacy, so let's try to inject even more noisy data that is not going to be detected by anomaly detection algorithms or it's not going to be detected as data poisoning because we're just going to inject it in the noise. So people are not going to detect me. So, and yeah, so we consider also the global case of differential privacy and the local case where each particular individual is sending their own noisy measurements. So in the global case, the attacker would be here after the aggregation, DP. And then in the local case, the attacker would be at each, it would be like a compromised sensor or a compromised phone sending malicious data, or a subset of them. And to model the adversary, we consider that they have two goals. So the main goals of the adversary is to intelligently poison the data in a way that is hard to detect. So we want an attacker to be stealthy. The attacker wants to inject noise, but they don't want to be detected. And the second one is that they obviously want to damage the utility of the system as much as they can, right? So they for example, in the traffic jam example, they want to say, well, I want to really create a traffic jam, just not like a little bit of an increase in traffic. So, so to model these two objectives, we have in classical DP, just to add some notation, we have a mechanism over a data set that gives you some output. And this output has a probability distribution F0 in this case. And the attack replaces, instead of using the distribution from the original differential privacy mechanism, it uses a different one. And what it wants is say, well, I want to, over time, over multiple interactions of this algorithm, I want to maximize the bias of the system. I want to increase to have the maximum possible deviation of the statistics that the system is computing. Subject to, it has two conditions. So the one is, well, whatever probability density, it has to be a probability density among all possible probability densities, so it has to be basically at the probability density function. And it has another option is the one that is the stealthy part. So I want to be as close as possible to the original distribution with some parameters. So this in particular is a multi-criteria optimization problem. So if you remember maybe your optimization class, you can, whenever you have two criteria, in this case, high damage but stealthy, you can put one as your optimization criteria and the other one as the constraint, and you can switch them apart, and the answer is going to be essentially the same. So you could potentially go, well, I want to minimize or maximize my stealthiness subject to a bound on the deviation. So our approach is interchangeable. But if you notice, this is a functional, the way we have set up this up is a functional optimization problem. So it's not a classical optimization problem where you can get numbers out of it. Our goal is to find a probability density function among all possible probability density functions. So it's a function A that satisfies this restriction over the input of the this integrable input. It has to add up to 1. And the question is, what is the shape of this function? So it's a functional optimization problem. And we solve this using variational methods as a way to, because these are tools that are useful in machine learning. They're used in optimization in general. They're useful in general to find the shape of functions or the structure of matrices. Sometimes you have a big matrix and you want to optimize it, but you don't want to, it's usually a very hard problem to do, or it's intractable. So with variational methods, you might say, well, maybe it's diagonal matrix or something like that. So it will tell you the structure of these things. So, and the trick using variational methods is that you replace the function or the matrix optimization problem that you're trying to solve with a parameterized perturbation of that function or matrix. So instead of optimizing this f of a, you say, well, I have f of a, but a little perturbation, and then I optimize over the perturbation. So this is the most mathematical slide to compensate for the verbiage of the previous one, but the high-level solution or the intuition is that we maximize the mean. So we want to increase the average deviation of the statistics that the aggregator is using or taking over the data, subject to, well, first I have to satisfy that the distribution needs to be a distribution, a probability density function, and subject to the to the divergence constraint. So this is the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the density of the real output of the system out of the original differential privacy mechanism and our adversarial input. So we don't want it to be too different. So this is the variational method approach. So you produce this approximation, and then you get the Lagrangian. You put this in the Lagrangian. So this is the objective function, and this is the first constraint. This is the Kullback-Leibler divergence, and this is the other constraint, the constraint that the function has to be a density function, and you have two Lagrange multipliers, and the solution is basically this form. So my optimal attack distribution is going to be of this form. It has to be f of 0 times e to the y over k kappa 1, and the integral of f of 0 r, e to the r kappa 1 dr, and this kappa 1 is going to be the solution to a nonlinear equation. So it's a closed form solution for the shape, but we still need to solve numerically a nonlinear equation that is going to depend on the particular distribution of the classical DP, of the original non-attacked differential privacy algorithm, or mechanism. So that's at a high level what we're doing, and so this is how it looks. So you have a data set that you have a query. The query is then given through differential privacy mechanisms that have some outputs, and this is a differential privacy mechanism that outputs solutions using the Laplace mechanism, which is one of the classical mechanisms for differential privacy. And the attacker, instead of using this one, it uses, instead of using this distribution, it outputs a distribution following this probability density function, where kappa is the solution of this to this nonlinear equation. So this is when the mechanism is a Laplace mechanism, the attack distribution looks like this, and this is how the attack distribution looks. So when gamma is 0, that means I don't want any deviation from my original mechanism, the differential privacy mechanism. So this is the exact Laplace distribution. When I allow some deviation and I say, well, I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of deviation because I want to achieve some bias into the data, the parameters, the density function starts getting lopsided. So in this case, that's the mean remains the same, but the tail starts increasing. So that's the attack. And in the paper, we also have the solution for the Gaussian distributions. I didn't put them in the slide because the solution for the attack Gaussian distribution is the same, is another Gaussian distribution, so it didn't look as exciting. But that's another interesting result. And so we also applied it to a couple of more practical examples. So we have previously proposed a differential privacy mechanism for protecting traffic flow estimation over a highway in California. And this is using loop detectors. So loop detectors are these sensors underneath the highway that are basically magnetic sensors that are sensing whenever these vehicles are passing through. And there's these algorithms in general. If you look at the literature of loop detection, they tend to use their own anomaly detection algorithms. They're usually called bad data detection because they say, well, sometimes there are sensors that malfunction, right? So we want to detect them as soon as possible. So they have these bad data detection algorithms that are based on some equations of the system. So they know how the flow of traffic, basically the velocity of vehicles coming in. So whatever enters has to get out. And they consider also like if the number of lanes, and if there's like, for example, a reduction in the number of lanes, how do you model that? So that's called the cell model. They have all this, I mean, I don't want to bore you with the details, but we have all this in the paper, and this is basically the estimate that they have. So they say, well, at any given time, we know sort of like the traffic flow estimate is given basically the previous one plus the basically incoming plus outgoing. And if my estimates do not match what I'm getting from the sensors, then I'm going to get suspicious and raise an alarm. So that's how the classic bad data detection looks like. So so we attacked this system. So at the beginning, we use it without differential privacy. So we have this is the post mile. So basically the mile in the highway. And this is the time of the day. And we say without differential privacy, if an attacker, I think we put the false alarm rate to be something very small, 0.001 or something like that. If the attacker wants to constrain to have attacks like a low probability of false detection, of false alarm. But, for a low probability of being detected, what is the maximum like attack that it can make? So in this case, it tries to create a traffic jam. So blue is like the highway is free. Here is when it's getting congested, like in the afternoon. So the attacker, if it attacks during this time, and wants to remain undetected, it manages to say, well, that it's not the highway is not as free as you might think, but it's still not a traffic jam. However, once we put DP with the same false alarm rate, the attack is able to basically create a traffic jam without being detected. So the question is now, can we do better? So we also propose a mechanism based on game theory that tries to sort of like anticipate what is the least favorable attack distribution and propose sort of like the optimal defense. In this case, we prove that that our algorithm satisfies a saddle point equilibrium. So it's a best strategy for the attacker. So the attacker can keep the optimal attack distribution of the previous time, and we can keep our optimal defense. The details are in the paper, and then neither of them has an incentive to deviate from this. And in this case, with a classical defense, we see that they can generate a traffic jam. With our defense, it lowers a little bit. I mean, it still creates a traffic jam, especially over time, because one of the things that happens is that over time, the error accumulates and the attacker can continue increasing. So if we leave, so basically what we're doing is slowing the rate of the attack. But eventually, if the attacker has all the day, then it can create any traffic jams. Okay. So yeah, we also have some examples on electricity consumption, but I'm getting alerted that I'm running out of time. So in conclusion, we have a growing number of applications where we needed to provide utility, privacy, and security, in particular, adversarial classification with differential privacy. There's various possible extensions. So for example, there's this notion of rangy differential privacy that is a different quantification of the privacy law, so that can be another metric for comparing how closeness the distributions are. Or adversary models. In our case, our adversary is fairly powerful. Differential privacy deals with that, for example, assuming that the adversary doesn't know everything, like in things like noiseless privacy. So maybe it's a less powerful adversary, but it has some uncertainty. And yeah, there's been also some related work recently on differential privacy and adversarial machine learning for the concept of certified robustness. So the idea there is like how to protect machine learning classifiers against poisoning attacks. So it's sort of like the converse of our approach today. So those approaches are basically how to leverage the results of differential privacy to improve the robustness of machine learning classifiers. This paper is sort of like the opposite. So, okay, now we have differential privacy. How can we attack that system? And yeah, with that, I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Thanks for the great talk. So I got a question. I'm wondering how general this approach is for different types of classification method.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can.
So, right, so classification method, I guess, is the anomaly detection algorithm. So, if you notice, what we did here was actually, in this case, the attack doesn't assume any anomaly detection algorithm at the beginning. So the attack is only saying, well, I want to be close to the traditional probability distribution of the mechanism, differential privacy mechanism. So it's not assuming a priori that we have a defense. And in a way, that's where we argue that we have a good strategy in our case. Machine learning, so more other general machine learning approaches are good when the data is when we don't know the distribution of the data, but in this case, we do know the distribution of the data, it's F0. So in this case, we can use precise results. In this case, well, I didn't put the details, but we were using basically detection hypothesis testing for detecting alternate distributions. But in general, it can be used for any machine learning classifier that you want to detect the anomaly. You can use it because the attack is not originally is not based on that. Yeah.
So I have a question. It's been shown in statistics for many years, and most recently in kind of modern machine learning, it has been reinvented. That if there's a tension between robustness and model accuracy, and these kind of approaches tend to, for robustness, they tend to typically lower the accuracy. And one of the ways it has been suggested in the literature for adversarial attack is to use methods that don't really try to put everything into one model. You could have parallel models that are checking each other, and that could help with the robustness versus accuracy problem. Have you looked into those approaches? Because this seems to be a little bit compromising from what I've seen here.
Yeah, so I think this is related to the last bullet point here on the related work on certified robustness, is it? I also see, I guess, having multiple algorithms is something like stacking, I would assume. So, yeah, in principle, in this particular case, in our scenario, we were assuming that we knew precisely sort of the normal class. And if you know the normal class, F0, we know precisely what is the best response. I guess if you don't know your normal class, if by somehow you don't know what the exact distribution is, because you have the differential privacy, and then you have some other sensor noise or some other source of randomness, then yeah, I guess you might need to use some other machine learning algorithms, and then maybe you can consider those approaches. But in this particular paper, for setting the problem, we knew precisely the normal class, and then that helps us a lot in the formulation of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the ground truth, then
right.
Nothing can beat that. Okay, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Okay.